Welcome to Constructive Conversations, the Residue podcast. Today we're glad to have Brian Green, an expert writer and presenter for the construction industry. Over the next few minutes, we're going to be looking at the topic of ESG and sustainability. Brian, would you mind starting off introducing yourself and a bit about Brickonomics and telling us a bit about your background in the construction sector?
As a kid, I wanted to be an engineer. I studied civil engineering. Then I decided I wanted to know a bit about how it all worked. So I ended up doing a course in industrial social sciences. I then became a journalist, which allowed me to find out more about the industry. And then around turn of the century, I guess, it would have been, I moved into sort of a more mixed role of consultancy type work and freelance work of one kind and another. Which has led me to doing lots of interesting stuff around how the industry works. Brickonomics was a title that picked up when I was doing a blog initially for Contract Journal and then for building, and it's just stuck with me, the name Brickonomics, because it's kind of what I do, which is building and numbers really, and writing. So that's what I do for a living really.
Okay, that's an interesting background and approach to it, but today's conversation, ESG, quite a big one for the industry. Tell us a little bit about what you kind of see as being ESG. What is where is the kind of important factors where they lie in ESG, and a bit about the kind of how that perception may have changed from where we are today in the past, and maybe even kind of a bit into the future there.
Well, I think the way I look at ESG is it's really about culture change as much as it's about anything else, and about an attitude change. But it's not really new in as much as we've had, I suppose it's tracked back to it goes back longer than that if you look at philanthropists. But if you look at the 60s, certainly in America, the growth of corporate social responsibility. So if you think about what corporate social responsibility is, ESG basically is that with metrics, so you can measure it, and it's all about measurement, I think, is the important difference between, say, ESG and CSR. For me, anyway, that's the way I see it. But I think what it is about doing business better, and it's doing business better for the environment, obviously. So we're looking at not using as much energy, being as net zero, being cautious with water, and being very careful about the materials and stuff what we use. Then you look at the social stuff. The social stuff will be making sure that you're doing the right thing by your society. So it could include the sort of philanthropic stuff that people have done in the past. But it's also internal. It's about the mix of people you have, that you've got diversity within your workforce, that kind of thing, and an inclusive attitude. And also the social stuff's around making sure that your products are safe. So those kinds of things. Governance is a bit trickier to define in some ways, or for some people, but really it's about, the key thing for governance, I think, is transparency. So that's to make sure that you're acting clean. Now, I think a lot of people in the construction sector will be very aware of, say, Carillion, for instance. And I think what we have to recognise is if you're a limited company, that isn't a right, it's a privilege, basically, because if you go down and under, society picks up your debts. Yeah. So that's a privilege, and I think people have to respect that, and with that should come a degree of transparency, and I think that's key to it, and accountability, and also having good processes in place. It's about being responsible. Ultimately, it's about a culture of responsibility to the wider world in every sense.
Yeah, so it's interesting, just we'll pick up a bit later about the kind of the ethical behaviours and practices and so on, particularly in relation to sustainability, but tell us a little bit about what you kind of see as the challenges and kind of in adopting ESG. How well are we doing as an industry, and kind of what are the challenges which may be holding back sustainability more generally? Because we're seeing a whole wave of these regulations, new Part F, Part L, Part O, Part S. There's lots of momentum behind a lot of that, and that's before you even start taking into consideration a lot of the other aspects of guidance documents and the London Plan and various other bits. Tell us a little bit about the kind of challenges and what your thoughts are on the challenges.
I think one of the challenges is the lack of awareness, really, and probably overthinking it to some extent. ESG is not going to happen suddenly. What I think is interesting about ESG and what's intrigued me is that in many ways it's the money men, effectively, investors, that are driving it faster than regulatory change. So regulatory change and expected regulatory change is part of it. But actually, if you want to see where the real drivers are, they're driven by people like the big insurance companies, the big investment trusts, all of those kind of people who are concerned about the risks associated, and they see ESG very much from a risk perspective. And so if you're looking at, let's look at net zero, just as a part of a simple thing to look at. Basically, the government is suggesting X, Y, or Z levels of B, or C, whereas actually the investors are really looking for people that kind of, A plus. I mean, and so you're seeing it coming really from the big clients whose share prices are being judged on that basis. So that's where the metrics comes in, so that the investors can start to see how good you are against metrics rather than just your corporate PR and spin. So I think that's what makes it really interesting. And for people further down the line, it's a different perspective because they'll be driven by the expectations of their clients. And one thing that I think is intriguing when you start scratching the surface of ESG is that it's about the whole system. So you're only as good as the people that you employ or engage, as it were. And I think that's something that people have to recognise. So if you're down the food chain, if you like, if you're a supplier to somebody, it's making sure that you're satisfying them. So they will be driving you. So actually talk to them, understand the relationship that they're looking for and the clarity that they're looking for, and start just collecting numbers and start looking at your business in a lot more detail. And what's interesting about doing that is talk to anybody that does, and they find loads of savings in other ways that emerges from that. So yes, it's scary. It's not going to happen overnight. People aren't going to suddenly be ESG. It's a process that they've got to go through, and they'll get better and better and better, hopefully. And with that, they'll find that they run better and better businesses. And broadly, the world becomes a better place. That's the optimistic view, at least, anyway. That's how I like to see it.
Yeah. So interesting you talk about this kind of move from a sort of a spin which a company can place on something and a claim versus kind of moving towards a metric-driven proof, physical evidence, if you like. And that's quite an interesting topic. But you mentioned this point, and I just wanted to ask you a bit more about the investor sort of part of it. Obviously, one of the things which is investors being very clear about is the fact that companies with a very good ESG strategy tend to be less badly hit in their share markets and so on because they're doing ethical practices are embedded into the culture of the business, not just into the words of the brochure of the business, if you like. Tell us a little bit more about that kind of investor-led thing. Do you see that keeping up the momentum? Are we likely to see other factors there in terms of kind of the approaches which for people taking mortgages and so on the properties and that aspect of the finance and so on there as well? I'm
not quite sure what you mean by whether people will be looking at who's taking on mortgages. I'm not quite understanding what you're saying.
I was more meaning the kind of the lenders behind mortgages and so on, and the investment in kind of greener properties.
All people are basically you're sharing in an experience in a transaction. Everybody that's sharing in that is a reflection of you to some extent within the sort of holistic way of looking at it. At the moment, in all honesty, a lot of the protocols that they're using for measuring and the different frameworks that they're using for measuring, there's a multitude of these things because it's in the infancy. But if you just think about it in terms of how long it's taken to develop financial accounting. This is non-financial accounting. It's all the things that aren't necessarily the money. I mean, they do have a play into the money, but it's those things. Now, there's a large number of different frameworks that people use. I mean, you can go to Moody's or to Standard & Poor's, the sort of risk credit people. You can look to other places. That, various of the consultancies will be coming up with their own form of ESG measurements. There's a whole host of metrics. There's an organisation called ESG Book, which is trying to create a standard form which is accessible and comparable and transparent, so that you can get a very clear idea of comparing things. But it's still got to be seen in its infancy, and people have got to start reacting to that because their customers and clients are reacting to it and will expect it. So for those people that don't think it's for them, I think they might end up changing their mind when their clients keep coming to them for lots of detailed information, because as I said earlier, I think you're as ethically responsible as all of your suppliers. And so, and that, I mean, there was a case of, a good example of that is how Boohoo, a fashion company, took a massive hit when it was found out that one of their suppliers were paying basically extremely low wages and not necessarily providing good conditions. So it's those sorts of things that people are beginning to look for. And you have to see it, as I say, from an investor's perspective, as trying to reduce risk. And that risk can be financial risk, hence they need good governance, something coming out of the blue that they didn't expect. Yeah. But it could also be reputational risk. So basically, if you're doing things that the public might find despicable in some form, then that's not a good look. That's going to hit your share price. And that's how investors are seeing it, those kinds of ways. And if you're doing things that are antisocial, etc., etc., that's how it plays, really, I think. And as I say, but the key thing is in the infancy, but it's moving, and it's moving very fast.
Yeah. So the whole point you'd make about metrics and measuring things and talk about standard frameworks. Well, one end of the scale you kind of got your standardized frameworks. The other end of the scale is kind of bespoke metrics that a company has created for their own desire. Now, there's obviously benefits of standardising for a comparable basis. You know, things like EPDs is a great example of getting your numbers into one understandable and comparable format. Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions in PAS 26 is another example. But things like the SDGs and choosing which ones a company may meet, where's the role and kind of what's the opportunity for a company to actually look at this from a point of view of choosing the ones which they're very passionate about, and actually the ones which they're probably more likely to deliver on as well. What's your thoughts around that area?
Well, I think people should start obviously with the things that are much more relevant to them. I mean, you know, if they're not really using very much water, then water probably isn't one of the things that they should be looking at. Not that they as much as they should be looking at. Where can you make the most impact, do you think, on that level? And also, to be quite honest as well, listen to what your clients are saying, listen to what your customers are saying, because ultimately they're the people you're trying to satisfy. Talk to your banks, talk to anybody. I mean, I think it's, I hate using the word, but a journey. It's a journey, and it's a long journey, and it's a never-ending journey in many ways. But it's just making sure that you're going along that path so that you don't get a nasty surprise later on when somebody says, I don't want to do business with you because you don't meet this standard. Or you don't want to be in a situation where they say, well, tell me what your emissions expectations are for the next year, or what your figures are, and you just don't have them ready, because that's not going to be a good look in the future for a lot of clients. I think it's going to be quite interesting. This is just coming back on it, I suppose. But it's quite interesting that the level of interest in ESG should have, and to some extent in some ways may have, taken a bit of a knock because suddenly oil became very fashionable, which is not necessarily the most ESG of things. So, you know, and investors have moved that money. So there might be a kind of a backlash. But I think you've got to look beyond these kind of waves of interest and falling away. There's an awful lot of money, particularly insurance companies and pension funds and stuff like that have a long-term interest. And for them, putting money in places that they see have a long-term track record and is the right way to go in the long term is really important. And I think ESG answers for them some of those questions. So you will get involved in it at some point, I think.
Sure. So there's certainly good long-term schemes. Science-based targets, one which comes to mind, which is very much a long-term thinking, but with a shorter-term kind of focus there. If we perhaps come back to the shorter-term aspects of things, and you mentioned about kind of putting a spin on it. Misleading claims and so on are something which we've seen tragically through the Grenfell inquiry. We've obviously seen more and more companies claiming things around the whole green aspect of things, you know, 70% reduction in transport emissions. Well, okay, fine, what's the overall effect and so on? But what's your thoughts around this whole area and the various claims we've seen across, I'm not just talking the construction industry here, across many different industries, as you say, Boohoo and so on, making some claims which don't stack up ethically and so on. But how can companies, particularly in this sector, the residential construction sector, ensure that they're genuinely pursuing the right things, the the ethical approach and practices, and not just making superficial claims or superficial choices where they're kind of being perhaps misled by something they're seeing and purchasing. What's your thoughts around this whole aspect of things?
I think ultimately it will come down to finding verifiable figures. That's the key to it. I mean, and it is a puzzling area, but certainly in terms of, if you look at, this is where I think it's really quite pertinent. If you look at the big house builders at the moment, they've got to the stage where they've kind of done stuff around their area. They haven't really started to look at the supply chain.
Yeah.
So for a lot of people engaged in the house building sector, that is to come, and they will start seeing it. And what's interesting is, I mean, a little bit of studying just out of curiosity, looking at how much interest different types of publicly quoted companies had shown within their annual reports in ESG or words related to that. And it's quite remarkable. If you look, the step change between, say, 2017 to 2021 is enormous. ESG gets very few mentions early on. It's just, most of its mentions have been in the period between, say, 2011 and 2021. Most of them are literally in the last year. So it's really building momentum. That's because they're closer to the money. The next step is their supply chain. So that wave is going to start hitting the supply chain, because they're going to have to start showing, for instance, their Scope 3 emissions. So they're going to have to start being curious about the supply chain. They're going to have to find out, they're going to have to make sure that there aren't any weak links in that, and they're going to be sorting out their supply chain. That's their next step, and so that's coming, and I think that's going to be an interesting one. In terms of the greenwash stuff, I think it's just trying to keep things, trying to push the case for transparency.
Yeah.
Because I mean, anybody that's trying to go down that route is going to get very irritated by people pulling the wool over other eyes. But one hopes that by shining more light on these things and publicising these, false claims, etc., hopefully when people start looking at the metrics or start questioning the metrics of those companies, those things will come to light, and it will be to their disadvantage to make dodgy claims, basically, I think. I mean, that's the way it should work. Whether it works that way in practices, who knows? But it's moving in that direction, so I think it's a risk you don't want to be taking.
Yeah, exactly. And so you mentioned the word, I think your words were track record. That whole aspect of proving that there's physical evidence behind the numbers that, there's probably a claim which can be made which might be truthful in its own right, and it may not necessarily be intentionally misleading, but I guess the important thing to keep coming back to is what are you actually trying to fix here? What is the actual end goal, if you like, and being able to articulate that. So if that end goal is about the reduction of carbon, it's articulating how much carbon that's reducing, not the percentage, but the actual footprint of what's being saved. And just kind of moving the conversation on from that detail of things, obviously understanding what you're buying is a critical thing, but if you're not very familiar with ESG and you're trying to work out which packages are sustainable and so on, I guess probably this comes down to understanding the best practice in the industry, both in terms of tier ones and all the way through to supply chain and installers and so on. But in terms of industry best practice, can you share some examples of some good ones within the construction sector, and kind of what can we learn from it? What can the listeners on this podcast actually understand more about?
Okay, I mean, I've tracked a particular company, and I've just known them for ages. It's a company called Lucas, and they do spray painting, and they do spray painting for top clients. And when I was looking into ESG, I had a conversation with, I know lots of subcontractors from years and years and years, and people in the supply chain. What was interesting was, and I expected this, I said, I mentioned the words ESG, straight on it. They were on it. They were, and what's interesting about that is that's because they want to maintain their position. They can smell where they can see which way the wind's blowing. They know and actually it goes deep for them, always wanting to be that kind of business. So they've been setting up their own approach to it, which satisfied blue chip clients, and they've maintained that and probably strengthened their position. So if certainly if you're looking at the top tier,
Yeah.
That's a perfect example, I think, of how you maintain your position there. Now, I think it was interesting when I was discussing it before with other people, say Simon Rawlinson, who sits on the Construction Liaison Committee, is that what it is? I can't remember the names of these things anymore. But anyway, we were talking to him and or Anne Bentley, again another member. I was discussing this with them, and one of the things that came out was, I think the comment from Simon was, it will become a permission of trade. You will need to have ESG to be able to trade.
Yeah.
It will be and the other thing that I thought was interesting that came out from Anne was, her view was that she felt you get tiers in the subcontracting base. So if you want to be in the top tier, and that's your aspiration, then you would be well advised to take it very seriously. And that's where the more secure work will be. That's where the best work will be, and you won't be precluded from working for other people either. So if that's your aspiration, I think there's every reason to take it very seriously. Does that kind of get to where you want to?
But likewise, the standards high up there. It's not.
Yes.
It's not for the claims, is it? It's for the actions and the people which are walking.
And they will test it, and they will test it, because the last thing they want in an industry that is riddled with risk from every direction, the last thing they want is to have things to worry about, because there's plenty of other things they could worry about, and trust. And I think there's an interesting point here as well, which is, because it relies on, rather than just going out and cheapest price what you can find in the market, you will actually go to people that you can trust. Therefore, you will forge greater links, which may well be part of what's been sought after within the industry, connecting the links between, stronger links between, through the supply chain. So that might be an interesting byproduct of this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And as we're coming through the whole Building Safety Act and all the rest of it, collaboration is a word which keeps coming up, competency a key word which keeps coming up. We're talking about transparency, but all of these things really rely on trust, don't they? As well as actually doing the right things. But I know there's a famous quote, isn't it, that there's nothing as powerful as the speed of trust. And I guess probably as we go down that sort of tiers you were talking about, we've got at some point the kind of, hitting basic requirements, legislation and regulation and so on. But what do you think the role of regulation and the government incentives and so on should be in actually driving sustainable change?
I think if the industry is, if commerce itself is actually starting to drive an awful lot of raising of standards, I think it's incumbent on the government and regulation to keep lifting the threshold, because most people are above it, so keep lifting it. That way you will get rid of some of the, for government it's a lot easier, because they're not having to do, they're doing they're pulling rather than pushing, as it were. And that will also take out, I think, a number of people that shouldn't really be in the industry, which will mean that those people that are causing issues for good trading companies get removed simply because they will have to reach higher hurdles. So hopefully it's a win-win in that on that level. So I would see raising the bar, and that should be easier as more and more companies gravitate towards what might be regarded as a more ESG way of behaving.
Yeah, and hopefully safer as well, because the likelihood is there's a correlation between those things.
Yeah, exactly. So it will gradually, and I think that won't be a bad thing for the industry, which has reputational issues anyway. So I think there's a lot of positives to it, and as I say, what's interesting is it's not really government that's pushing this. That's not the really big driving force. It's the people with money, and after all, that's what everybody's looking for to some extent. They're the ones that are feeding the industry of it for its contracts and stuff.
And that's good, because that's what makes it stick as well, isn't it? Money talks.
Well, I think it does. I mean, it's a bit crude perhaps, but it is it keeps it simple in those terms. But as I say, but I do think government has a role in that, to be aware of raising the minimum standards as a consistent part of that.
Yeah, sure. So we've talked quite a bit over the environmental part, the E of ESG, if you like. And and that whole sustainable aspect in terms of carbon and what have you. What about the social and governance point of view? What is the role of social and governance in company strategies within the construction industry? And kind of what kind of impact can these make on welfare of workers, safety of workers, community engagement, the things which we would see in many other industries perhaps as being quite, I'm thinking of things like fair trade here and so on, and things which we've seen in many different ones in terms of FSCs and the way you're buying timber and the sourcing and so on. But what about the S and the G, kind of what's their role in construction, and how can we effectively improve that aspect of sustainability?
How can we improve it? I think it will be asked of rather than how can we. The how can we is, as I say, I think it's looking at the various metrics. The more you look at your business, the clearer it becomes what works for you and what works for society. And I think that the engagement of the industry within society more deeply is going to become increasingly important, because there are huge challenges ahead. I mean, everybody keeps bemoaning the fact that it has a bad image. Well, change it. And hopefully being more engaged with your communities, being seen to be less dangerous, being seen to not providing products that don't work, all of those things will enhance the reputation of the construction sector. But ultimately, looking at it from a sort of a crude ESG kind of perspective, or the sort of the metrics of it, it's just measuring things and looking much more closely at what you do. And I keep coming back to this. I think the more, this is a conversation I could have had I did have 20 years ago. The more you look at the numbers of these kinds of things, the more benefits you'll see inherent in how you do your business. You will unlock problems in your business because you're looking at things and you go, I didn't realise that was happening, because you're walking past and missing it. But if you're actually looking at the numbers, that will reveal to you fault lines in your business, which you can then mend, which makes your business better. And that's as much around making sure that your governance is in place, that you're doing transparency correctly, that you're measuring everything, etc., correctly, that your ethics are up to scratch, and on the social side, that you've got the right kind of people working for you, that you don't have a bullying culture, that you are engaging with the community more widely, that you're drawing from the community as much as you can, so you're part of the community. All of those things will help sustain you as a business. Now, if you're a borderline criminal, you're a borderline criminal. There's not a lot you do about it. You will behave that way, but hopefully that will flush more of those types of businesses out of the way. I mean, and I think, and that will make the nation stronger, I think. So I think it's incumbent on us all to try to improve those aspects. And I think they can be chucked into this kind of culture wars thing, but it's nothing to do with that. It's just making work and making the nation a better place to live. And I think the rest of it is, and as I say, going down that route will enhance the company's strength.
Yeah, definitely.
I believe, anyway.
Yeah. So we've obviously been looking through the lens of social and governance and so on, and things like pre-manufactured value is one of the things which people are looking at for social. Have you got any particular thoughts on that whole aspect of pre-manufactured and so on? I guess what you were just saying there kind of relates to that, is that if you're making more off-site, guess what? It's easier to manage and the quality probably goes up as well.
Yeah, I think I have a strange relationship with the whole notion, because I think we have to go a bit. There's an awful lot of problems in terms of the way in which pre-manufactured is used. I mean, I think it's obviously right, but it's also about, have we got the right business models in place? And I think the industry has to start looking at, I mean, the challenges with, just taking off-site manufacturing of housings, for instance. The challenges with those are business models, there's scale issues, there's also how the payment systems work within all of that, and they're as challenging as the technical side. And there clearly is a technical aspect to that, because if you make a mistake, you replicate it an awful lot. So there's always that fear. So there are a number of fears, but I think realistically, it's always been going towards pre-manufacturing. I mean, people used to make bricks on site. They used to mix concrete on site. They used to do all of those kinds of things, whereas now we bring things in. So that's a trend. I think we can get overexcited with it, but actually looking at the wrong things. I think what we need to be doing is how do they culturally fit with what we're doing? How can we make sure that they're right first time? How can we get the real benefits that they bring? All of those things need to be concentrated on, rather than just trying to get the numbers of prefabrication or pre-manufactured, as they like to call it these days, up. I think that's an intriguing one, because yes, there are huge benefits from having people working in factories rather than on site, and history will tell you that's been going on and on and on and on. So it's moving in that direction. So there are huge benefits, but we've got to make sure we look at the other aspects, and they are about transparency. They are about making sure that we have the right business models that work with those kind of things. I mean, it's an interesting. This is an anecdote from years and years ago. 40 years ago. Looking at, I looked at as a dissertation. I looked at offsite of timber frame housing as a development in England, as it was at the time. Obviously, they'd done it a lot in Scotland, etc., and how that worked as looked at it from an economic and social perspective, to kind of when I was studying that sort of stuff. And what was really interesting about that was that one of the reasons that they moved, there were a number of reasons. There was a technical issue that forced them that way, but also the other reason was because house builders could sell the house and then pay for the frame. And given that an awful lot of them were contractors, that kind of cash flow thing really impressed them. So when we're looking at the mechanism of change, they're not just about it's a better way of doing it. The motivations and the mechanisms can be a whole host of different things. They could be technical, they could be social, but they often are financial as well. So I think when we're looking at these things, we have to start questioning, have we got the right business models, as well as are we using the right technology? Because I don't think you should be able to, you shouldn't mentally separate them.
Yeah, sure. So what do you think the role of technology and innovation is here? And is there anything you're seeing promising in those kind of areas to improve sustainability?
Well, certainly measurement. didn't have Excel spreadsheets in my youth, but no. One of the things is, and certainly around measurement, it's much easier to do measurement and things like that now. I think you can overdo measurement, but actually the ability to be able to measure the things that matter, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
I think, and that's one of the things, and collecting of that data and analysis of that data.
Yeah.
That's, and obviously technology comes along. Again, I think, I'm not anti-technology, but it might sound as if I am, but I'm absolutely not. But what I worry about is people using the technology rather than using the technology because it's there, rather than because they have a need and they find the technology to fit that need. And I think you don't want to be grafting technology onto things just because it's technology, and you can get a big thing and say, look, aren't I using the latest whiz-bang technology? I think what you need to do is to use it as a means to get the solutions. You're looking for solutions, and and look widely at all the tools, and even if they're simple tools. If the simple tools work, use it. But technology just widens and increases the toolbox that you're at your disposal, and I think that's really important.
Sure, yeah. So there's no substitute for collaboration and that deep working together of different parties across the supply chain, and certainly at the early stages of the project where you can have a big effect.
Exactly. And I think, again, coming back to the point we were chatting about earlier, I think ESG, because you're focused around a set of things that you're all interested in, you're all looking to maximise the good from, as it were. I think that breeds collaboration, and I think ESG should help it, and actually it creates a tighter relationship, and actually hopefully builds trust, which is critical. I mean, you can look at endless numbers of reports on the construction sector, and so many of the things are being said time and time again about the industry, and I think that we've got to try to sort some of that. And I think ESG and the sort of culture that it hopefully breeds will take us a bit further along that path towards finding solutions to these long-standing challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm an optimist.
That's good. And so I guess kind of as we come to a close, is there any kind of key takeaways you could give for anyone who's listening who might be wanting to make an impact themselves, and maybe part of a bigger picture? What's your thoughts on that?
The advice I'm given from smaller companies certainly is talk to people a lot, talk to your clients, see what they think. Examine your business from as much as you can understand ESG. Read a bit more about it, get to understand it. Don't be frightened of it, and just keep making small steps in the right direction. I think we can, people always, it's a danger obviously, particularly when you're in a kind of an engineering kind of environment or a technical kind of environment, to want to get to the solution. It's, it's going to take a long time, and it's just a process of just improving gradually. My advice would be also, the biggest piece of advice is don't ignore it. I mean, even if it's not for you, don't ignore it, because you don't want that coming as a surprise when suddenly you find most of your clients aren't using you anymore because they've decided that you can't give them the metrics that they need to feed into their ESG profiles.
Sure. So just adding to that point as well, and that's a really valid point you make there, is make some kind of action, move in the right direction. But don't look for the shortcut. Work by the principles of the thing.
Just keep moving in the right kind of direction, and just making, and certainly, and obviously what you're clearly trying to do is you're always looking for the low-hanging fruit to start with.
Yeah.
Well, that's obvious, because you want to see some progress, you want to see some benefits.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be, it's not, I'm told I don't have to do it in that kind of way because I have a low carbon footprint and I don't consume much and all the rest of it. So I don't have this problem, but what I'm told from people that do is that it's quite tough, but it's beyond rewarding, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's the key to it.
That's something we definitely improved ourselves as well. But Brian, thank you very much for your time.
It's a
It's been
pleasure.
very, very enjoyable to talk to you about the whole kind of challenges and the uptake and the future of ESG and sustainability. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been great. Thanks.